Hi guys. So in today's lesson, we're going to look at why did the death penalty end in Britain. Our learning objective is fairly straightforward. We're going to understand the events that led to death penalty being removed, or a term we're going to use here is abolished in Britain. Now, before we begin, just a reminder, you should have your worksheet in front of you. That's in Google Classrooms. The top of it should look a bit like what you can see on the screen there. And the work is due in Sunday, the 7th of June at 5 p.m. Please make sure you press submit. If there's any queries or any questions, feel free to email me, gbrown@stocksleyhighschool.co.uk. Okay, so if we look at this worksheet we've got here, let's look at the first task. And you can see I've put a series of dates there. Now, as we go through the slides, you are going to see those dates in bold on the slides. All I want you to do is complete the timeline by telling me why that time period, whether it's a year or whether it's a decade, like the 1920s, why that was significant for the death penalty, what was happening then. I've done the first one for you, and you should be able to fill in the rest as we go along. Like I've said, they're in bold on the slide, so you can go back and add that information as we go through. Okay. So, for centuries, since the beginning of this course, public execution had been the ultimate deterrent for ensuring people obeyed the law. If you committed a severe crime, you were killed. We've seen that right from the very start of the course in the year 1000. Why did public execution end then in 1868? Why was it we stopped killing people in public? Well, if you remember, there were a few reasons why. Firstly, this had over time become a source of entertainment. It didn't scare people anymore. It was no longer what we call a deterrent, where it puts people off committing crimes. And actually, people would now attend these public executions. People would come from miles around to come and see them. There were often scenes of crime as well at the executions. People would be pickpocketing, distracted viewers of the executions, or there'd be things like prostitution there as well. And so public execution wasn't having the desired effect of fear and respect. Instead, it was turned to a source of entertainment and a source of even more crime. And so as a result, execution continued, but it was done behind closed doors. It was done in private as a result, rather than being in front of a crowd. Now, the death penalty was still kept. It was seen as cheaper than prisons. You're removing a threat from society, so they couldn't possibly reoffend again. And it was seen as an effective form of retribution or revenge. It's this form of justice. If you have killed someone, then we should kill that person as well, an eye for an eye. But there were still some changes to the death penalty from this time. And so, for example, it was made illegal to kill under 16s from 1908. And as you can see there, I've put that in bold, so you know that's a date you need to look through and add to your timeline for a bit of information. So we move on to the 1920s, and some campaigners wanted the death penalty gone. There were some people in Britain that said actually it was inhumane, humans killing other humans. They said it was uncivilized, that we as a society should be able to deal with our problems in a more effective way. And they said it was morally wrong. They said it's wrong for the government to say it's wrong to kill people, but the government was killing people themselves. And also they argued this clearly isn't effective because murders are still happening, so this isn't a deterrent. They said it was possible for the wrong person to be killed. And they said, look, countries like Sweden, they've got rid of the death penalty, and it's not affected the amount. The murder rate hasn't gone up in Sweden, it hasn't shot up since they got rid of the death penalty. Well, we could be the same in Britain. These protesters, though, they had little effect, and the death penalty continued throughout the 1920s without any real change at all. In the 1930s, a few politicians started to campaign for the end of the death penalty. But most politicians, the people who could change this law, well, they looked around at the people of Britain and they saw most people in Britain wanted it to stay. And so they didn't want to risk being unpopular, the last thing a politician ever wants to be. And so they just kept the death penalty as a result. The only change that was made during this time was 1933, when they said the death penalty now could not apply to under 18s. So the age that you could be killed is slowly going up. And really, until the 1950s, this is where the changes to the death penalty stop. because people seemed happy with the death penalty. And it took, over a space of 5 years, a series of controversial executions to really start to change people's opinion about the effectiveness and how correct it was to kill people. So let's look at those three people one at a time, these three case studies. And our first one is Timothy Evans, and he was killed in 1950. Now, Timothy Evans lived in a small flat in Rylington Place with his wife Beryl and his young daughter. Now, the couple were poor, they had money problems, they often argued like many couples do, and Beryl became pregnant again, and they could not afford a second child. They just couldn't afford it. They were barely surviving as it was. And so they agreed that they would need to have an abortion. The problem was having an abortion in the 1950s was illegal. Now, John Christie, a man who lived in the flat below, heard of these problems, and he said he could conduct an abortion. Although it was illegal at the time, he knew what to do. He would be able to solve the problem. And Timothy Evans said, "Thank you very much." And he said, "Leave your wife with me." So Timothy Evans went out. When he came back, Timothy Evans was told by John Christie that the abortion had gone wrong and that Beryl was dead, and that he had to leave because he was going to get in trouble. Timothy Evans would get in trouble. And so John Christie said, "Give your daughter to me. I'll look after your baby. You need to leave now." And so Timothy Evans panics and he flees the scene straight away. He leaves his dead wife, he leaves his daughter with John Christie, who promises to sort it all out. Now, after a few weeks, Evans hasn't told anyone about the situation. Evans comes back, Evans talks to Christie, says, "I want to see my daughter." And Christie says, "No, that's not possible." And Timothy Evans, as a result, goes to the police station. He says, "Look, my wife has died in suspicious circumstances." And the police start to do a little bit of digging around, and they find the dead bodies of both Beryl and the daughter as well. And they find them in a warehouse that belongs to Christie. But Evans is accused, and Evans is found guilty of these crimes. Why is that the case? Well, the first reason is because Evans often changed his story. It was a habit he'd had since childhood, where often he couldn't make up his mind about things. Now, the first time Evans came in, he didn't mention Christie at all. He didn't say that Christie had given an illegal abortion because he was trying to protect his neighbour, who he thought was doing him a favour at the time. He was asked, when he was told about the bodies of his wife and daughter, he said, "Are you responsible for them dying? Did you cause this?" And he said yes, which was seen as an admission of guilt. People were able to give witnesses like Christie in court saying he'd heard them arguing with Beryl before. And the shock of finding out his child had died as well, the fact that Evans was questioned for long periods of time, relentless long periods of time, there was a fear of violence from the police, Evans said as well, unless he confessed, led to Evans basically saying, I'm guilty. He cracked, and he gave a false confession. So, in 1953, Christie moved out of his apartment and new tenants moved in. And they noticed a smell in the kitchen when they moved in. And they sort of peeled back the paper and it revealed like a secret room. And there were 3 dead bodies in there. 3 people that John Christie had murdered. And then under the floorboards in the flat were another 3 bodies, including John Christie's wife. And when Christie was found, he confessed to killing Beryl Evans and 7 other people as well. He was a serial killer. There might have been many more people that Christie had killed that we just don't know about. And he was executed in 1953. Now, if Timothy Evans had been arrested, that would have been bad enough. An innocent person arrested, accused of killing his wife and child, spending years in jail. But he wasn't arrested. He was killed. And Timothy Evans died in 1950 with the world thinking he had murdered his wife and murdered his child. And by the time they realised they'd got the wrong person, it was too late. Our second case study, you might have heard of this one before, Derek Bentley. Derek Bentley died in 1953. Now, November 1952, Derek Bentley, aged 18, and his friend Christopher Craig, aged 16, they were trying to enter a confectionery warehouse at night. They were trying to break in. Now, they'd armed themselves. Craig was armed with a gun, and Bentley was armed with knuckle dusters in case he got into a fist fight. Now, the police were told about these two young men trying to break into this huge building, and they were caught on the rooftop by the police. And a policeman restrained Bentley, held him back, and the policeman yelled at Craig for the gun. He said, "Give me the gun." Now, this is where it becomes suspicious, because Bentley supposedly shouted, "Let him have it," which Bentley denied. Bentley said that never happened. Craig said he never said that phrase either. Let him have it. And Craig shot and killed a police officer. PC Sidney Mills was tragically killed at the scene. Now, Craig had fired the gun, but he was 16 and therefore he was too young to be facing the death penalty. If you remember, that had changed in the 1930s. But at the trial, the jury found both Christopher Craig and Derek Bentley guilty of this crime. Now, yes, Craig had fired the gun, but they said, look, Bentley was with him. They said Bentley had encouraged it by saying the phrase, "Let him have it." They interpreted that as shoot at him, fire the gun, let him have the bullet. And that made him guilty as well. He was just as guilty as Craig. This is what we call joint enterprise, when you've got more than one person working together on the crime. Now, the jury said that Bentley should have a plea for mercy, that actually he was guilty, but mercy should be given to him. But the judge ignored this. Now, people were outraged by this as a result, as Derek Bentley was sentenced to be killed. Why was this the case? First of all, Bentley hadn't fired the shots. Bentley hadn't fired the gun at all. Also, Bentley had a severely reduced mental age. Tests show he had about the same mental age as a 10-year-old. But this wasn't mentioned at the trial. And also the phrase, "let him have it," wasn't something typical that Bentley would say. And in fact, there'd been a similar case about 5 years previously where the phrase "let him have it" had been used in the shooting of a police officer. And so some people believe that that phrase was just stolen from that case and used here as well. It wasn't a typical phrase for someone like Bentley to use, "let him have it." You don't hear many 10-year-olds say that. Bentley had handed himself over to the police and he was being restrained. He was technically under arrest when the shot was fired. And he'd even warned the police that Craig was armed. "Let him have it" could be interpreted in two ways. It could have been, "let him have it, fire at the police officer," or it could have been, "let him have the gun, give yourself up, pass the gun over." And when the phrase is so vague like that, you do not know what meaning there is there. Now, 200 members of parliament wanted to debate the execution, which shows how controversial it was at the time, that so many members of parliament said, no, we need to talk about this before we kill this individual. But the courts, before this protest could happen, before a date could be booked in for a protest like this, the court executed him. He was taken to prison and he was executed as a result. And that night, 5,000 people protested outside the prison, which shows, again, public opinion swaying of the death penalty. What happened next with Bentley? Well, 28th of January 1953, he was executed. It took until the 30th of June 1998 for Bentley's murder conviction to be quashed, or what we call removed. So he was no longer accused of murder as a result until 1998. And that was a result of decades of campaigning from Bentley's parents, Bentley's half-sister, and the daughter of Bentley's half-sister as well. Constant campaigning to remove that murder charge. Let's look at one more case study. Okay, Ruth Ellis died in July 1955, aged 28. Now, Ruth Ellis had had a series of relationships with abusive men in her past. And she'd become pregnant during a relationship she was having with the child of a racing driver, David Blakely. So there's David there, the racing driver in the picture. And so Ruth Ellis was pregnant with this gentleman's child. However, Blakely was abusive, and during an argument, he had punched her in the stomach, causing a miscarriage. Just one of several times that Ruth Ellis suffered domestic violence. So, after a few months had passed, Ruth Ellis drove to a pub called the Magdala in London, where she saw Blakely's car. She got out of the car and looked for David Blakely, and she saw him leaving the shop. She called out to him twice, The second time, yelling as he was clearly ignoring her. She was ignored. So she then pulled out a gun that she was carrying, shot him 5 times in the back in the packed street in London, and then dropped the gun and gave herself up straight away to a policeman who was nearby. Now, this was seen as a clear indicator of murder, lots of witnesses, found guilty, and she was executed in July 1955. But again, there was more to this story. There was public outcry over this, a petition of over 50,000 signatures from the public asking for leniency for Ruth Ellis. So why is this one so controversial? Well, first of all, she had been given the gun apparently by another man that she was having an affair with called Desmond Coulson. And Ruth Ellis said she'd been trained by him and driven to the pub by him, which he denied. Also, Ruth Ellis didn't have a mental state questioned, despite the fact she had had so much abuse before that clearly played a part on this. Clearly she just cracked under the pressure of being a victim of domestic abuse for so long, if you think about the emotional pressures that would have on you as a result. Now, about 90% of the women who were convicted of death in the 20th century didn't actually face the death penalty. Usually it was overturned and they would go to jail instead. But this didn't happen with Ruth Ellis. And actually, she was a mother to 2 young children already, who would face losing their mother, obviously, forever if she was killed. So, if we have a look here then, you should still have these 4 gaps on your timeline if you've been filling it in incorrectly, finding the dates when they've been in bold on the slides. Now, we're going to come back to those 4 in a minute, okay? So don't panic that it's not finished yet, but let's just have a look then at those 3 controversial executions that we've looked at here in such a short space of time. And have a look at task 2 for me. Can you explain for each of these controversial executions why this led to public opposition to the death penalty? Why was each one seen as maybe unfair by the public? Why did the public start to think that this person shouldn't have died? What causes were there for the public to have this outrage? Pause the video here, complete that task 2, and then press play to continue. Okay, so let's finish up this timeline then by looking at what happened after these controversial executions. What happened because the public mood had started to change in Britain. So, in 1957, the Homicide Act was passed. And this meant that the death penalty was only given out for 5 types of murder instead of basically every murder. So these types of specific murder would include committing 2 murders on separate occasions, or killing a police officer, or killing someone during a theft, for example. And this reduced the amount of executions that were in Britain. That was reduced down to about 4 executions a year after this. But in 1965, the death penalty was suspended. They were going to see if people could cope without the death penalty in Britain, how well the justice system would work without it. And by 1969, the death penalty was removed for most crimes as a result. Now, a few crimes still carried a death penalty from 1969. So, for example, espionage. If you were a spy, you could still be killed. Arson in the Royal Dockyards, which basically means blowing up boats that belong to the Navy, for example. And violent piracy, which basically means being a violent pirate. But even in these crimes, for example, if you were captured as a spy, you were still not killed. The last person to be killed in Britain was 1964. And by 1998, to clean that up, the death penalty for all crimes was ended as a result. This was because of the public opinion. We had seen in the 1920s and the 1930s that the public weren't really interested in removing the death penalty. So members of parliament didn't really get involved, the people who could change that law. And then we see in the 1950s these controversial executions, the public mood changing. And so the members of parliament who represent these people debate and they start to slowly end the death penalty as a result. So you can just complete that timeline for me, please. Those 4 dates there. Pause the video to do that and then press play to end this lesson. And that's it for this one. So, thank you very much as always, guys. This work is due in Sunday, the 7th of June at 5 PM. It's just those 2 tasks. It's the timeline and it's reviewing the controversial executions. Why were they controversial? If there's any questions or feedback, gbrown@stopsleyhighschool.co.uk. In the meantime, please look after yourself. Please make sure you're getting breaks. Please make sure you're getting regular exercise and fresh air as well. Thank you for completing the work. Take care, and I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.